I'm Megan Cooper. I am a senior about to graduate from Syracuse University in just a few weeks here. And I'm presenting about my work at the Brooklyn Land Trust this summer. Um, as George mentioned, we did have a workshop with folks at USI coming in, and I'll talk about that a bit later. But I'm really going to focus on the role of youth engagement and education in building resilient communities, especially in my work in Brooklyn and Queens this summer. So just for a bit of background, the Brooklyn Land Trust was formed in order to protect a bunch of gardens that were going to be sold on auction at the request of Mayor Giuliani under his administration. Thankfully, due to a lot of gardener advocacy and the help of Attorney General Spitzer, those gardens were saved. A number of them, some of them were sold for development, and the Trust for Public Land helped to save a bunch of them beyond what the city parks department runs, and these are private community gardens that are in a trust, so they can never be sold. They are permanent open spaces. The Brooklyn Land Trust currently has 35, as well as a lease on 2 others. And this idea that the gardens can't be sold or developed is really important to what we do at BQLT, because it means that no matter what, there's not going to be a major change in these gardens. We want to make sure that gardeners know that that space will consistently be there for their communities as our communities change in the city. So beyond bringing gardeners into these spaces, BQLT also takes care of all of the tasks that a garden might not want to do or might not have the capacity to do while they're also working on producing food. So we repair damages that come along, we make sure that gardens stay operational, and we have them have a governing structure. We cover garden water costs, and we complete all nonprofit paperwork and provide liability insurance to gardens. But it's also really important that BQLT expands and brings new people into our gardens that represent the fullness of the community members that live near them. So that is what inspired the work of our internship program. Last year, BQLT applied for a grant in order to fund an internship. We've had 2 internship programs so far. The one that I worked on was the summer internship, which is what I'll be talking about here, but we also had a fall internship led by Sarah, who did great work with a group of interns, as well as 3 continuing interns from the summer that developed on their projects. So I'm just going to go through a little bit about what the goals for the program were and what it looked like, and then talk about why it's important and why that we want to continue doing this work. So first, we want to encourage students to consider joining gardens, participating. We want them to be introduced to concepts of community resilience and organizing so that they can advocate for themselves in garden spaces and otherwise. We want to share BQLT's history and mission with a younger generation, share that garden beginning that came out of a space of resistance, out of trying to make a space that can bring in community. We want to support BQLT gardeners in completing necessary tasks that they may not have capacity to complete, and I'll show some examples of that as well. We wanted to encourage high schoolers to develop experience working in gardens and engaging with nature, especially when they've spent their whole lives living in New York City. They might not spend a lot of time actually physically touching the dirt. And that's super important for all of us. We all could probably agree that that's a really meaningful experience. And then we wanted to support interns in exploring what they're passionate about and with others through a final project. So currently, our BQLT gardens are going through a pattern of succession that's really important in why this program was developed. A lot of the gardens were created out of these acts of resistance that I spoke about, and many of the gardeners are an aging group. And so in continuing the gardens and continuing their impact, we want to make sure that there are people who can continue to do that important labor beyond coordinating what times people will go to the garden into actually the physical work tasks of weeding, maintaining garden beds. So that's part of what brought our BQLT interns into the garden, and it's why it's so important that we are continuing to bring new generations into these spaces. So now I'll walk through what we did each week. It was a 6-week program, and each week we went to 3 different gardens. Sometimes we went to a garden twice, but generally we went to a different garden each day. Our first week focused on soil, although that wasn't the week that George came to talk to us. We really got to know each other. We spent some time weeding a space. We planted some pollinators, got to know each other. We enjoyed a good bug suit. Learned a lot about what it means to be a part of a community and get to know each other a lot so that we can move forward in following weeks. In week 2, we talked about trees. This is us in Bainbridge Community Garden in Bed-Stuy. We spent a lot of time removing an invasive area of bamboo from the garden. And we engaged with a lot of community members that were confused why we were taking it down. We shared some of the bamboo with people who wanted it to plant it. This is one of our interns, Rodney. He developed a passion for pruning trees on this day with Nora, a garden volunteer. Week 3, we talked about water. We took a trip to Newtown Creek and visited the digesters there. And we also had a visit from New York State Assembly member Zinnerman to talk about the important role of water in gardens and her work to try to make water free for BQLT gardens and other privately owned gardens, as well as making sure that she was able to share with us her work in urban agriculture and bringing urban agriculture to the state level, and really bringing that into the assembly. And all throughout this, we're getting closer. We're having really important conversations about what it means to be a member of a community, what greenwashing looks like, what sustainable development looks like in our communities, what a climate resilient community looks like. We're meeting new gardeners in different spaces. This day we went to 2 different gardens and engaged with gardeners there, learned about what challenges they are faced with. The interns learned to ask questions about what is important to the gardeners, what makes them excited to be members of their garden. And then this is George. And when we learned about soil, we tested soil at one of the gardens that we were based at many days. The interns loved it. They learned so much and got to look under microscopes. Week 5, we focused on community and culture, and we visited a few gardens that are specifically dealing with issues of succession. We worked with one of the NYU fellows who was at BQLT this summer to learn more about community organizing and governance structures, and in relation to her project. And this really gave the interns an opportunity to move beyond the physical labor and talk more about the overarching themes that we'd learned throughout the time, especially approaching their final projects. And then on this day, one of the last few days that we were spending in Brooklyn Gardens, we spent time building garden beds for a community garden that is struggling to have a lot of hands to help continue garden tasks, which was really rewarding. We had to cut the wood with this saw that Rodney is holding here because we did not have anything other than that. And so that was a good problem solving option for us. Very fun and a lot of bonding. And then our final week, we spent one day at the Peconic Land Trust on Long Island, learning about how different land trusts operate and how land is conserved and for whom. They taught us about their different sites that they have, which include their teaching farm, where they work on more sustainable agriculture goals, and as well as their oyster farm, where we learned about how they're actively responding to a changing climate. They shared that they had to rebuild portions of this walkway recently due to rising sea levels. And then on the final day of the internship, the students shared their final projects, which I'll talk about in a moment. So all throughout this process, we were really interested in the community reaction, especially myself and Irene, who's here, one of the board members. From the first day, we noticed people would stop a little bit longer in front of a garden when they saw a group of young people there. People would come up and ask us questions. They would be curious about what we were doing, if there were events coming up at the garden. They'd say, oh, I've always walked by here, but I've been curious about joining. gardeners would engage with our interns. They would teach us about their personal knowledge of the issue of gardening, of agriculture, which is really important so that especially students in New York City high schools have this understanding of book learning as the most important type. They were able to learn from knowledge of doing through these garden elders that they spoke with. We also had community members ask for discarded materials like the bamboo, and parents of other high schoolers asking how they could get involved. And every board member from BQLT that came and joined us, every guest that we had come visit us was so excited to see the work that they were doing. The interns were a really passionate group, and as time went on, that only grew. And it was really exciting to see that number of youth in the garden really produced an impact. We had people come to the gardens as a result of our time there. So the interns learned a lot from us. I have some quotes of things that they said at the end of the program. They were really excited about the things that they were learning, passionate about the work that we were doing, felt that it was meaningful to actually, do something physical that can help people and make a difference and see that in front of their eyes, as well as learning about a topic they might not have heard before. But I also think it's more important, perhaps, to think about what we learned from them. I personally went into this not knowing quite what to expect. I'm not trained in education, and I wasn't sure what I would come out of it with. But I wanted to feature two specific final projects from my interns that really showed me the importance of this work. And before I do, I want to say that there were other interns that also contributed a ton. I had one intern who told me that he was going to tell his family not to buy a new car because he was learning about the impacts of cars in our city and learning about the ways that public transit can be used instead. Every intern had their own evolution in their learning along with me throughout this, but I did want to talk about two projects that really directly impacted BQLT's work. So Samiha's project was Community Gardens and Culture, a deep dive, and it focused on the role of culture in gardens, focusing on a number of different gardens and reflecting on the role of her culture while visiting them. And Alex wrote an essay focused on the three different BQLT gardens and their governance styles, arguing for the benefits and downsides of each. So I just took some quotes from each of their papers. These are long, they don't need to all be read, but in Alex's essay, he really closely analyzed three different forms of government: majority, consensus, and authority, and used specific examples from our gardens. This information was shared with our board members as well as with the gardeners there, and he approached this incredibly thoughtfully. He didn't outright criticize anyone, but simply thought about the ways that each could be improved, and the ways that each served the community that it was a part of. We had board members and garden members that felt that this was really helpful for the way that they go about operating their garden, and especially his perspective as an outsider to the gardens was very valuable in informing the way that the gardens operate now. Samiha's project was unbelievably thoughtful. Her work focused on the way that different cultures interact within the garden space, something that's really important in Brooklyn and Queens right now as we talk about the issue of gentrification and changing communities, and the way that multiple different cultures can be addressed within the same community garden. We had one gardener at United Herkimer who brought us callaloo after she showed it to us in the garden, and we all tried it. And Samiha realized that her family had been eating the same thing under a different name for a while, something similar to what we realized at the Brooklyn Botanic Garden, where we learned multiple names for the same plant. And we talked a lot about how there's so many interconnections that develop from that, and how being aware of our differences helps us to come together around food. especially in the case of food justice and food sovereignty, we really want to make sure that we're being inclusive of all of these different connections and continuing to learn from each other. There's so much beauty in even learning how to prepare the same food in multiple ways. And Samiha really dove into that. So moving forward, we are working to continue this program. We're looking at future funding options in order to keep this going. In the fall, we had students from multiple different schools. In the summer, we had only students from Brooklyn Tech, so that's something that we are looking to do. And then feedback from interns suggested more long-term projects at one garden rather than jumping around, as well as maintaining our connection with former interns and including their perspectives. When we were wrapping up the program, everyone was very interested in the ways that they could use their experience to bring other students into those spaces, and how we can continue to bring youth into the garden space. And this last sentence is just a little bit cheesy sum of take, but I think it's really true. I learned a lot from this experience. I think that there's so much that we can learn from youth involvement and intergenerational connections in our garden spaces. And if we want to have climate resilient communities, close communities, we need to have all of these perspectives involved, especially young ones. And yeah, so thank you.